seafood has this absolute amazing mystical nature to it that is just incredible.
Sitting in a market in Lisbon where they have beautifully designed and decorated colourful tins of local fish.
If you get some amazing prawns and poach them yourself, you can really control the texture of the prawns, you can control the flavour, and it's actually really easy to do, and it's really quite exciting. Summer is here, and it's such a great time of year. Few things enhance a celebration during summer quite like seafood. I'm Anthony Huckstep, and today we have something really special. We have legends of the Deep in the Weeds network, host of Dirty Linen, and the producers, Dani Valent. How are you, Dani?
Hello, I'm very well, Anthony. How are you?
Good. I generally didn't get that right, Dirty Linen. And legend, our special guest, seafood savant, fish fiend. He's wet, he's scaly, and he's a great bloke too. Host of Fishtales, a seafood podcast, John Susman.
Howdy, Hucks. How are you? Howdy, Dani.
How are you, mate?
Fantastic. Yeah.
What are you guys up to? It's summer.
Finally.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely thinking about eating a lot of seafood. I have to say the Victorian summer has not been everything it might be. So there's the cover is still on the barbecue, I have to admit. I'm sure we'll get there.
John, you're looking pretty calm. This time of year is pretty frantic in regards to seafood. How are things faring at the moment?
Look, it's really interesting, Huck. It's been a strange year. I mean, we're back, we're out. Restaurants seem to be busier than they've ever been. But it's we normally use a couple of metrics as we sort of glide into Christmas in the seafood industry. First is Father's Day in September, and we generally see a rise in demand through to Melbourne Cup, and then we see a massive spike from Melbourne Cup to Christmas. And it hasn't actually been like that this year, but it's probably not been a bad thing because supply is way down. So we're actually seeing a really massive drop in the amount of particularly wild fish coming to market, which is a combination of a whole range of things, not the least of which is there's been some fairly significant access reduction in the wild fisheries in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia in the last 12 months. But retail's been soft, which is strange because obviously during COVID it was really, really busy in the retail world. But I guess it's because everyone's seemingly out eating in restaurants. I don't know. What are you seeing out there, Dani?
I'm definitely seeing a lot of seafood platters, probably an unconscionable number of lobsters on plates and quite a few retro dishes, even the odd Mornay, a lot of butter and herbs. And I think also what I'm seeing is so many people are cooking over fire and charcoal. There's just a lot of charcoal grilled prawns or tuna that's just been, kissed with the grill. So, I mean, there's a lot of great flavour out there, got to say. And
in terms of how busy are you seeing the restaurants in your part of the world?
Yeah, really busy. I think it's still a mixed picture. So especially in Melbourne, the suburbs are cranking and the city can still be a little bit quiet. But as we get closer and closer to, Christmas and the sales, I think people are flooding into the city. Still, a lot of people are working from home at least a couple of days a week. So it's a different landscape. And people that I'm speaking to, I think they see it as it's not just a lag or a period. It's the new normal.
John, you and I have discussed before that during winter there's an abundance of incredible seafood out of cold waters, but summer really is the celebration of seafood in this country. I mean, I have memories growing up. My stepdad used to drive to the fish markets at 4 a.m. every Christmas Eve and grab whatever he could, usually swordfish or scampi or prawns, and we'd have a feast on Christmas Day of just about any seafood that we could fit in the budget. What is it about summer and seafood in Australia, even though there's such incredible seafood in winter as well? Yeah,
look, it is. It's a really interesting thing, and I know we've shared a few schooners of Reshes over this topic many times, actually, Huck. It seems that sun and sea and surf means seafood, and it seems just as mad as perhaps the notion of spending 6 hours murdering a turkey in a hot oven on Christmas Day. That that it seems much simpler. It seems much easier, and certainly through my generation, we've seen this transition out of hot Christmas Day to a far more relaxed, simple protein, which is seafood, of course. I mean, it's easier to digest, it's easier to eat, it's easier to prepare, particularly if it's just a cold platter or something. So it makes so much more sense for our environment. And recently talking with some guys in South Africa about what they do at Christmas time, and they mentioned that theirs is all about sort of simple, barbecued or cold seafood as well. So it seems pretty logical to us. But as you said, I mean, there's a lot of really fantastic seafood that's carrying its winter fat during the cooler months here. So it's almost oxymoronic in some respect. But we do have, we've got some major crops of the farm prawns that come out at summertime. And we have, plenty of other farmed seafoods that are, sort of taken popular position in food culture now. But a lot of the wild fish, surprisingly, aren't in their best condition over summer, which is kind of strange.
Dani, what are your memories of seafood as a kid growing up?
Geez, I mean, I have to say fish fingers are the first thing that come to mind.
Same.
Yeah, I mean, my mum didn't really cook much fish. I think that she's a great cook, but as far as fish goes, I would probably say she's one of those people that, needed a bit of hand-holding to get a bit braver. And, the work that you guys have both done with your book and, of course, with all the other work that you do, and just, I guess, encouraging people and giving them that confidence to cook fish. I mean, we camped a lot, but we literally never, threw a fish over fire or anything like that. My early attempts at fishing were disastrous. You cannot cook a sock. So I'd say, my family is probably not that unusual in Australian families in that, my dad is from Europe, living on rivers but not on the sea. So there just really wasn't that culture in my family.
John, you've shared many a seafood yarn over the years with me. It may or may not be over Aresh's, as you mentioned earlier. Do you have any yarns from when you were young that sort of got you into seafood and forced you into a career later on?
Yeah, look, I guess I was lucky that my mother, bless her, was a pretty terrible cook. She could do things with lamb and 3 vegetables that shouldn't have been legal, but at the same time she was very enthusiastic, and she was married to a bloke my old man, who was a sort of a cross between Keith Floyd and probably Indiana Jones, and so every summer was jam-packed full of adventures, and Dave Susman was considered himself one of the best amateur fishermen in the world, and so there'd be plenty of sort of fishing yarns and fishing stories, and even if he didn't catch any fish, I'd be sitting in the back of the ute in front of the Normanville Hotel, where he'd be sort of inside, sort of negotiating to buy fish from other amateur fishermen that had been out on the water for the day. But so there were plenty of Christmases where we were doing, having Tommy Rough sandwiches for lunch that were, that was all that got caught. There was no King George whiting or cray or whiting. Well, there may have been as well. So, so I was pretty lucky in that sense that, from a very early age, I was sort of tagging along with the old man fishing and summer and, sort of down on the Fleurieu Peninsula in South Australia. For my first 17 years of life, I'd spend 12 weeks fishing. So it was a lot of fun. And then, that's my lasting memory of Christmas is, seafood at the shack.
John, your office overlooks the auction floor at the Sydney Fish Markets. If you were going to head downstairs right now, what would you grab?
Good question, Huck. I mean, I'd having seen what was on the auction floor this morning, I'd probably be looking at some of the wild prawns. I mean, it's we're not long until Christmas now, and prawn prices are beginning to take their annual spike. But we are still really lucky in this country to think about the value or the price that we pay for amazing wild seafood. And so some of our crustacean, I mean, we've still got lobsters at low prices due to the China closure. We've got crabs at good value. We've got prawns at great value. Even, to be frank, oysters in this country still represent pretty good value. So from that sort of big end of the platter side of the fence, the seafood world is really well serviced right now. I think, what am I going to do? I'll probably go and grab a cray. There's some crays and some prawns that are coming through at the moment that are just fantastic.
John, we always hear you should, make friends with your fishmonger, have a chat, find out what's good. I mean, are you seeing, I feel like some of my local fishmongers aren't really that up for a chat, or they don't really know much beyond, who the wholesaler is. They're not really going back and back and back all the way to the ocean or the farm. I mean, how do you find like the right fishmonger, and then what are some of the starter questions that you ask them?
Look, it's a really good point, Dani. I mean, we could sort of swim through the world of the problems of the seafood industry and why retail tends to be sort of lagging somewhat by comparison to sort of other proteins. I mean, we've seen a squadron of rock star butchers arrive in the last sort of half generation. We've got amazing dairy merchants and delicatessen operators and even fruit and veg guys that are really leading the way in terms of providing that stewardship, if you will. Seafood is a really tough business. There's no question about it. It's wet, cold, smelly, slimy, highly volatile, and there's this sort of expectation that, when you go to the fishmongers, you should be able to find, a three-tiered cascading display of everything that swims, where you don't expect that at a butcher shop. You walk into a butcher's and he's got 4 animals, or 5 if he carries chooks. But, somehow, somewhere in the scheme of things, there's been this expectation that there's this massive, continuum of supply in seafood. And that does create a whole range of issues. And further to that, we don't actually have a national industry body that's stewarding, I guess I won't call it professionalism, but just knowledge perhaps. And so unlike, being a butcher or a baker where you go through your formal training, and even if you're the world's worst butcher or baker, you've actually had some official stewardship as to, what constitutes good, better, best. It is a complex and very difficult question, and good fishmongers are hard to find. There's no question about it. But that's the joy of the search, in my opinion. Once you find a good fishmonger, and there are plenty of good fishmongers out there, you want to hang on to them, and you do want to have that relationship. And yes, I understand breaking the ice with them can be quite difficult. As you say, I mean, the supply chain in seafood is a lot more convoluted than it is in say, red meat. But that's a function of everyone in the supply chain playing pass the parcel to literally get the seafood out of their hands before it goes off. And so you don't have those sort of that long connectivity that you might have in other areas of the food business. But on a positive note, the quality of Australian seafood continues to improve, despite the fact that I'm moaning about the fact that there's a reduction in production. The quality team is getting better and better all the time, and we can sort of generally be buying with confidence that there is a good quality. In terms of the things that we would typically be searching out in terms of provenance and history and who actually caught the seafood or grew the seafood, look, we've got a job to do in the industry to try and bring those sort of people further upstream in the supply chain and get them in front of you to understand who they are and how what they do and how they go about it.
Are there any species that are really safe bets, perhaps some underloved ones that even if you don't have a fishmonger that's up for a huge chat about things, are there some real go-tos that perhaps we're not looking at as often as we might?
Yeah, look, it's a good point. I mean, perhaps a really easy point to start with is, even if your fishmonger's not up for a chat, if you walk into the shop and there's something that's abundant and it's relatively inexpensive, then that's what you should be having a think about. I'd be forcing the hand. I mean, I'd be forcing the hand of the conversation of saying, well, when did this come in and where did you get it? And if they got it from the market or if they got it from a vendor, whatever. But as a point of reference, if there's a volume display and it looks looks like it's good value, then it's worth having a crack at. I always find it difficult to just nominate a specific species, because I think that kind of almost flies in the face of what we want to try and do by eating underutilised species, which is to sort of think about, the whole nature of sustainability. And sustainability is about not just having a sort of a single species focus on our plate or on our pan. So, we might love a skinless, boneless portion of salmon that is perfectly cut, but if that's all we eat, then it's not a really sustainable practice, irrespective of what the salmon farmer may have done in the production. We've got an obligation as consumers to eat sardines one day, or eat squid another day, or eat octopus a further day, and to sort of really undertake the role of enhancing our own repertoire. Even if we're not comfortable in cooking it, we still need to recognise that we can't just eat the same thing all the time when it comes to seafood, because that's not sustainable behaviour. But having mentioned the sardines and the squid and the octopus, these are species that, in less than half a generation, we've seen these three species come off the hook and get onto the plate, and they've moved from bait to the plate, which is fantastic. And those sort of things, and they're delicious and they're nutritious, and when they're well handled, they're absolutely supreme products. So
summer can get pretty hot, and people are eating seafood. But what are some of the keys to handling seafood during summer and eating it at its optimum? Keep
it cold. The temperature, particularly heat, is the absolute antichrist for seafood. It's got to be kept cold. It really, it is there. I mean, whilst I would suggest that, like not eating seafood at 1 degree necessarily gives you all of the enjoyment that you're going to get out of eating it when it's sort of like 10 degrees, where the sort of flavours and the fats start to really come out. But in the interim, from harvest to plate, it needs to be kept as cold as possible. And that's absolutely worth the investment of a $5 bag of ice from the petrol station to make sure that you've just gone to those extra steps to keep the prawns under ice until you're actually sort of ready to eat them. Keep any fish that you've bought well chilled. And ideally, if you've gone to the fish market and you've bought it and it's in a plastic bag, get it out of the plastic bag, dab it dry with kitchen towel paper, wrap it in like a go-between or a baking paper, and put it at the bottom of the fridge where it's coldest. That's kind of really where you should be thinking. And ideally, you've got a dedicated Tupperware container with a cake rack in it that you can just sit that wrapped piece of fish or seafood in a sealed environment at the bottom of the fridge.
Huck, what are some of your go-to seafood dishes?
Well, over summer, I actually really like to poach prawns. A lot of people buy prawns already cooked, and that's fair enough, because everyone's time poor and everyone has different budgets. But if you get some amazing prawns and poach them yourself and make a simple prawn cocktail or something like that, you can really control the texture of the prawns. You can control the flavour, and it's actually really easy to do, and it's really quite exciting. It just requires a lot of salt, a lot of water. I think it's about 160 grams per 2 litres, isn't it, John? Is that right?
Yep, bang on, 8%, yep.
Yeah, and which is pretty salty water. It's not a soup. You don't want to be drinking it afterwards, but you cook the prawns in that really salty water very quickly and get them out into an ice bath, and the texture, the flavour, like it changes a prawn cocktail, because you can't control the quality of those that are already cooked when you purchase the ones you purchase. But that's something I definitely go to. And I also like to poach a whole side of king salmon as well, just in like a court bouillon. You don't have to do anything. That's the great thing about it, is that all you have to do is heat up the fancy vegetable stock essentially, and pour it over a whole side of salmon and just let it sit in the hot water until the water cools, and then you peel the skin off, have it with a horseradish creme fraiche or something like that, and some salad and vegetables, and it is the best way to feed a big group of people, and it's bloody delicious.
Love that.
And how simple is that? That's absolutely right, yeah.
I think one of my favourites is flathead tails in a beer batter and just fried with baked potatoes or shoestring fries if I can be bothered. But just so simple. Actually, learnt that from Michael Bakash, where he cooked up some flathead on the beach at Mount Martha, exactly using, it's just like flour, make it well in it, break in a couple of eggs, half a can of beer, drink the rest of the beer while the fish cooks. And it's pretty fail-safe and so tasty.
John, do you have a favourite seafood eating story that you've had around the world that you can share?
I've got about 58,000 of them, I think, actually, Huck. Nothing fails to amaze me about the wonderful world of seafood eating in terms of just the flavours and textures and the time and place. I mean, it can be hanging your feet over the wharf at Port Elliot eating some blue swimmer crabs that were just out of the water, or it can be having an oyster that was in an estuary on the Hawkesbury 15 minutes prior, or it can be sitting in a back alley in Bangkok eating a barbecued fish. I think that's the thing that really excites me about seafood, is just this myriad of experiences you can have, and they don't have to be grand. They don't have to be sitting in a fancy restaurant in a big city. They can be just really humble experiences that just really relate to the nature of the protein that I don't think you get in any other terrestrial food. Seafood has this absolute amazing mystical nature to it that is just incredible, and it creates a nostalgic sense of relationship with where it's come from quite quickly. So it's every seafood experience for me is a good one, unless it's bad.
That's a good one.
How about you, Dani?
I reckon, I don't know. I hope it's okay to talk about tinned fish, but what came to mind was sitting in a market in Lisbon where they have these incredible stalls with all these beautifully designed and decorated colourful tins of local fish. So yes, sardines and mussels and I don't know what, like mackerel, I want to say. I don't that might be wrong, but that you can have them opened for you and drink them with a glass of Portuguese wine, which is an adventure in itself. That really stays with me.
Yeah, and tinned seafood is actually quite extraordinary. I mean, it gets a bit of a bad rap because it sounds like a sandwich filler in Australia, but you look at somewhere like Continental Deli in Sydney that has the most extraordinary tinned seafood from around the world, and it can be an absolute delight and change your world.
And with a canned martini as well.
So, I mean, look, I'm totally in agreement there. I mean, if I was to sort of put a prediction in for the next, sort of 24, 36 months, I think we're going to see the rise of the enjoyment of conservice, of, quality conserved seafood in tins and other forms, but like particularly the tins. It's been sort of for 150 years in Europe and parts of North America, but I think we're just seeing the beginning of the journey here in Australia, where we're moving up from the 80-cent tin of Serena at Woolies to other things. But not to say that 80-cent tin of Serena from Woolies is a bad product at all. In fact, to the contrary, I think it's still a massive part of our annual seafood consumption. I mean, it's kind of just flown under the radar, I think, for a lot of us that live in restaurant land, but it's still the single largest seafood item sold in this country is tinned tuna. So, there's a lot of people that's their first experience with seafood, their first entry into the wonderful world of seafood. So, but I think what we're talking about now is the even more exciting aspect of these beautiful artisanal, incredible breadth of flavour and texture of the conservice, and I'm really excited about where we're going to go in this country with those over the next few years.
What about you, Huck? Have you got a favourite seafood eating experience?
Oh goodness, like John, I have many, and in a past life, pre-COVID, I was a restaurant critic eating in far too many restaurants a week, and have had some extraordinary experiences. But one that probably comes to mind the most is I have a great love for sea urchin, and I was actually with John down in Coffin Bay, and we were hanging our feet over the edge of a boat on an oyster lease of all things, and there was some sea urchin on the poles in the oyster lease, and we pulled them off, and John somehow pulled out a loaf of white slice. I don't know where he pulled it from, but and having white bread and the butter of the sea with your toes in the water was, I just got a shiver thinking about it. It was just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
And that is the absolute beauty, Huck, is that that level of simplicity is what drives the enjoyment of seafood. It doesn't need any spherification or Parco jets to convert it into something that's delicious.
Well, John, you've been trying to educate people and hold their hand into the world of seafood for a long time, and you wrote a book, which I've heard of, the Australian Fish and Seafood Cookbook.
You wrote a book. Yes. That.
With a couple of interesting co-authors. Tell us a bit about the purpose of that book and your mission to try and shepherd people into seafood and make things a bit easier and not as intimidating.
Well, I think in fairness, Huck, you were the genesis of that whole idea. I mean, I think you just got sick of me being your partner in partner in crime in various reviewing, and me bitching and moaning about the fact the chef didn't know anything what they were doing with the seafood, and me as having spent 20 years as a fishmonger crying in the shower at 1:30 a.m. thinking what sort of bullshit am I going to have to listen to from chefs for the next 16 hours, had driven me to the point of despair that you said, well, stop whinging about it, Susman, put it out on paper. So no, that was the purpose of the exercise, I think, as I recall. It is very much so. I mean, as we said before, look, it's such a unique category in terms of the vast array of different animals that you're dealing with. And in the void of there being, any sort of formal stewardship by us as an industry, or indeed, the food schools and colleges, I think that they're still using the same teaching methods as they used back in the 70s and 80s for the seafood category, where day one, class one, it's sole bon femme, and the first step is defrost the frozen sole. So I think that there's a long road to go in terms of getting people to understand and experience seafood. But my enjoyment is actually seeing when you get people to experience something for the first time. I mean, sea urchin is a classic example, Huck. I mean, it's such a unique animal, and it's such a unique and defining flavour and texture profile that when you put sea urchin in anyone's mouth, and I don't care whether it's a 3-year-old or an 80-year-old that hasn't eaten it before, and you can just see their eyes go wide open, and it might polarise. They might hate it, they might love it, but at least it's got them thinking about that seafood. And I don't think there's a single other seafood that has that depth of reaction as soon as you put it in anyone's mouth. Similarly, if you put a really, really beautiful piece of just fresh fish that's just simply grilled into anyone's mouth, I'd argue that that you cannot have a great experience. You cannot not have a great experience in that environment, because it's just so easy and delicious to eat. So it's the challenge really is getting people to get outside of their comfort zone, and that may be salmon, or it may be tuna, or it may be a prawn. Get them outside of their comfort zone and get them to explore and experiment. And look, it's a complex discussion. I mean, we live in Australia. We've got an amazing abundance of different species, but they can be very regional. So, media might focus on a fish that's coming out of Corners Inlet in Victoria, but that's not much good to a bloke who's living in Cairns or Carnarvon. And similarly, there are local preferences in those waters as well. So it's it's a multi-tiered issue that we face in seafood and the enjoyment of seafood. But the challenge really is for all of us to just get out and eat more. He says with a gratuitous plug.
I'm happy to take that on as a challenge and an opportunity.
Yeah, great. That's the stuff. But I mean, look, what are you guys seeing? I mean, you guys are food professionals. I mean, Dani, you're in and out of restaurants all day, every day. You're talking to chefs all day, every day. Huck, the same with you. What are you hearing about, what are they thinking about seafood at the moment? I don't know. I'm sort of one out, one back in that conversation a bit.
I think definitely everyone's interested in sustainability, on every part of the menu and the kitchen. So that's a big conversation. So as much as Tassie salmon is probably still ubiquitous in restaurants at a certain level, I'd say there's definitely people exploring beyond that, which is great. Yeah, I mean, I guess generally, and, certainly over the past, 10 and 20 years, a lot more raw dishes. I'd say it feels like the year of the kingfish carpaccio or the kingfish sashimi has extended for about 10 years. So that's pretty ubiquitous. And I suppose it's almost like, yeah, it can be a bit dull, but it's almost like a control dish, like a tiramisu, which I'll always order if it's on a menu. It's like, can they do a good one? If someone can surprise me with a raw kingfish dish, then I think that's pretty good. So I don't know. I feel like overall it's still a bit safe. I'd love to see more species on menus, but we're getting somewhere. I'm eating a lot of delicious food, that's for sure.
One of the things that I find fascinating is the influence of social media, which has been good and bad on the food industry, however you want to look at it. But I think it's been a real advantage for seafood in a lot of ways, because chefs are seeing what other chefs are doing, in an instant. And I think that's been a benefit for seafood, which has been a little bit harder for, it's a harder category to get right for chefs compared to some of the terrestrial meats and things like that. And seeing and getting excited about different species being shown on their phone or cooking techniques has helped them or shepherded them and given them more confidence to do things as well. And I think as a result, we're seeing a bigger array of species on menus. And, sometimes you might see too many of the same cooking technique. I think fish cooked over fire could be like the kingfish carpaccio of 2023. But I think there's a benefit to that social media aspect where species are being seen to be championed on menus, and that's having a filter effect.
That's interesting. I mean, I certainly agree entirely. I'd sort of perhaps put the point that there's a bit of Cirque du Soleil action going on social media as well, where some techniques are being presented that require a really unique set of skills and a really unique environment to actually execute them safely as much as tastily. And I fear that some of those techniques are perhaps taking, chefs with not the same level of skill as perhaps the practitioner that's displaying them down the wrong path. And I'd like to see a bit of moderation in that regard. There's a real concern for me about this current fad of dry aging or aging fish, for example. I'm yet to be convinced of its real merits, and yet it's attracted popular culture amongst the chef community like I've never seen anything in seafood in 35 years. And there are some elements there that make me nervous that perhaps chefs aren't as confident as they should be because they don't have the skills they necessarily need in the repertoire of seafood preparations, that they're just blindly following with a sense of necessity rather than of actual sort of achievement. And I think that that's something that really needs to be questioned, and questioned quite loudly. It's not a suggestion of fault. It's just more of a suggestion that I think we need to be aware that, we don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to seafood. I'm absolutely enamoured with Neil Perry's restaurant Margaret, where he's chosen to only sell wild seafood, and it's only ever grilled. And it's extraordinary because it speaks to me of the first time I ate it at Scott's in London, or the Ivy, or Dave Pasternak's seminal seafood restaurant in New York, Esker. these global restaurants that were only ever serving simple grilled wild fish. Champions like Mike Bakash, similarly, they're following that path of they don't have to reinvent themselves with any crazy techniques. They're just sort of really doing an amazing job of respecting what is a very fragile protein.
I mean, it sounds like what you're talking about is that, chefs perhaps aren't as grounded as they could be with these skills or this, contact perhaps with whole fish, with just, finding the beauty in, filleting and portioning a whole fish where they sort of want to fly before they can walk to some degree. I mean, does that go back to TAFE, to apprenticeships? Like, where do you think we pick this up to improve it?
Look, Dani, you're absolutely right. I mean, and, the finger can only be squarely pointed at us in the seafood industry. We have failed in our job as the contemporary food world has exploded in terms of its thirst for information to deliver that stewardship of handling and preparation and enjoyment to a large extent. And so in the void of that solid grounding that we as an industry should be providing the professional in the trade, let alone the consumer, there's in that void, it's been filled by the Cirque du Soleil style preparations that have meant that there's this sort of immediate attraction, because when they're brilliantly executed, they're amazing, but the degree of difficulty is so high that it's not an every cook activation. And that's my fear, is that, we collectively, the educators, and the education has to come back to the industry. We're at fault here. We haven't provided the TAFEs. I mean, it's easy to have a crack at the TAFEs, but we haven't provided them with the stewardship or the motivation or the inspiration to change what they do on a day-to-day basis. But I am really hopeful that, the market must see that places like Bakash, a 30-year veteran of doing, a 35-year veteran of doing what he's doing, is busier than he's ever been. Neil Perry's new restaurant is the busiest restaurant in Sydney by a country mile. The really simplicity of the execution is that you've got this market that has got money and they're prepared to spend, but they're not necessarily looking for that Cirque du Soleil experience every time they go out.
We're so savage about the Cirque du Soleil in this podcast.
Hey, I love Cirque du Soleil. I love Cirque du Soleil.
We have no particular set against Cirque du Soleil. We just don't want to eat it. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, when it comes to eating, I'm never a fan of unicycling, breathing fire and juggling eggs at the same time. But, that's just me.
Well, speaking of eating, do you guys know what you'll be cooking in regards to seafood or serving sort of this festive season?
I reckon I might copy you with the king salmon, because that sounds super easy. Like, you could do it ahead, and then I'm just feeling some, really fresh herby garnishes. I've just co-written an Iranian cookbook, and there's just such a beautiful abundance of herbs in that cuisine that I've really become very inspired by. So it's sort of like, if an Italian sees a recipe that calls for 1 clove of garlic, they'll naturally put in 10. So I'm applying the same principle to herbs at the moment. It's just like, build it up, baby. So I'm thinking that king salmon with a whole bunch of herbs.
Well, that book is my favourite book of the year, Dani. It's bloody brilliant, and that dish does love a lot of herbs. John, do you know what you're doing for Christmas?
Well, I'm hoping not to be subject to the 4,000 light beers and a burnt turkey at my in-laws. I'm with you, Huck. It's going to be poached prawns, poached fish, and perhaps a few crays. And of course, we're going to see oysters. We're going to see rock oysters this summer that we hadn't seen for the last couple of years in any abundance. And early conditions are suggesting that they're going to be some absolute beauties. So yeah.
Woohoo!
I'm pretty excited by that. I mean, the day that I learnt to shuck an oyster changed my life, good and bad. Like, it meant that I could never buy a pre-shucked oyster again, but it also means that every time we have oysters at a family get-together, I'm leaning over the sink for about an hour, making sure everyone gets oysters.
As you should, Huck.
But you sling yourself a couple, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one for you, one for me.
Exactly.
Love it.
Well, John, host of Fishtales, a seafood podcast, and Dani Valent, of course, from Dirty Linen and the producers. Awesome, as always, to catch up with you guys. Have a cracking summer. We love what you do on the Deep in the Weeds podcast network. Let's catch up soon for that drink and a bit of seafood.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Huck. Great to hang out with you and John today.
See you soon, guys.